the idea being that it's so hard to move policy, it's so hard to change enforcement, that if we can help equip residents and those working with them, their family members in particular, with the information that they need, with the knowledge about their rights and resources to help them advocate for their residents, that is another way of hopefully improving care and improving dignity.
Hey y'all, this is Kosta, and today I'm here with my guest, Richard Mollot, Executive Director of the Long-Term Care Community Coalition, a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving quality of care, quality of life, and dignity for elderly and disabled people in nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and other residential settings. Today we're talking about the ethics of eldercare. So Richard, first, I want to thank you for all the outstanding advocacy and change you've brought and are bringing to nursing homes, assisted living, and all residential care. Can you share with us what inspired this journey and how you started working in this industry?
Yes, and Kosta, thanks so much for inviting me today and for your very generous words. I actually had no knowledge of really or interest in elder care when I first started, other than having been a family member. Of course, I had two grandparents who were in nursing homes before they passed away. But I had I was always interested in doing kind of civil rights work, and I found this work very interesting because of the vulnerability of the population and the fact that people in long-term care, to a large extent, really can't be a voice for themselves, although that's something we try to promote, of course, and to help them to facilitate their being a voice. But for the most part, they are kind of shut in, and they depend upon, of course, their providers for, generally speaking, for all their care 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that makes it, I think, really interesting. And the more I learned about the experiences of residents and families, the more committed and passionate I have felt over the years about this line of work.
Did you have a personal experience when your grandparents or your parents were in the nursing home? Did they receive poor care, and that's kind of what invigorated you?
Actually, not really.
Okay.
That's a really interesting question, and I hadn't thought about it. I guess I've always thought more about realizing their vulnerability, but I would say for the most part, they didn't have great care, but they had, as my grandparents, but they had pretty decent care.
Adequate.
But I do remember when I was very young, my great-grandmother being in a nursing home, and this would have been probably in the 80s, maybe even before the federal nursing home reform law.
Right.
And I remember she was like tied into a wheelchair. The nursing home smelled bad. She had nothing to do. She was sitting alone in her room, and they'd given her rubber bands to play with. I mean, I'll always remember that. And that has been something that has inspired me, something I think about.
Yeah. Well, and the reason that I bring that up is because, like, you were talking about the Nursing Home Reform Act. That was in I think the mid 80s, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was under Reagan. It wasn't under Carter.
Yes, it was 87. Yeah.
87. Okay. So what happened for nursing homes to become that in, leading up to 1987 for Congress, which, takes a lot of resources for Congress to act on any private sector industry. But what happened for them to sort of go back or go down this terrible road of providing such awful care?
It's it's really interesting. I guess, like with so many other things, especially in our country, when money starts going into a sector, people, companies start coming in, and sometimes they tend to be more predatory than otherwise. So I think historically, and this is well before my time to be honest, the nursing homes were more what we call mom and pop. They were sometimes family owned for generations after generations. Okay. People who either, and they were not for profit certainly, and they were more not for profits in the past than they are now. That's been decreasing over the years as more money goes into this field. But essentially, you had to some extent at least, I would say, people or organizations that had a connection to the community and not necessarily that they were do-gooders, but that they wanted to sustain a good business in the community.
Right.
And or if they were not-for-profit or government-owned, were committed to providing a service. And what we saw was with Medicare and Medicaid coming in and inserting a lot of money into nursing homes. As nursing homes became places where people went for post-acute rehab, the Medicare rehab after hospitalization, from a knee replacement to stroke, et cetera, and then people going in for long-term care, and that's most long-term care in this country is paid for through Medicaid,
right?
And that covers close to 70% of the nursing home payments nationwide. There's a lot of money. I mean, a lot of federal and state money that goes into it, and it's also, from a business perspective, a steady source of money. So you don't have to wait about you don't have to worry about the vagaries of someone skipping out on a payment. The government's going to be paying,
right,
and that those payments are consistent and guaranteed. So that's where this really came in and tried to change things.
And so I want to make sure that we kind of develop a timeline so that when we're talking about the current issues, people have context about what's happened in the past. So nursing homes get an infusion from the Great Society, Medicare and Medicaid, and so they go down this rabbit hole of poor care. Then 1987, the federal government steps in. They pass the Nursing Home Reform Act. Do things improve after 1987?
Well, what led up to the Nursing Home Reform Act was actually there were some tremendous scandals in the industry. It came out just some extremely poor care going on, and really neglectful and abusive conditions throughout the country. And at the same time, the Reagan administration was very much committed to deregulation. And so there was a lot of I remember when I was a kid that they were proposing counting ketchup as a vegetable for school meals.
Yeah, I heard about that.
And so the Reagan administration had proposed reducing the regulations, and there was an outcry. At the time, there was an organization called the National Citizens Coalition for Nursing Home Reform. Now it's called the National Consumer Voice. And they led, essentially protests against this.
Wow.
And as a result of those protests, the administration agreed to hold off, and there was an Institute of Medicine study, and that Institute of Medicine study found that actually there needed to be stronger standards and regulations rather than weaker, as the Reagan administration had proposed, and that's what led to the nursing home reform law.
But I mean, so like you go through the 90s and the 2000s, the 2010s, were things going in the right direction following the law?
I'm sorry, yeah. So I would say kind of fits and starts. I think we certainly have, I don't think we generally don't see as many situations now as we do when I mentioned about my great-grandmother and it's smelling bad and being alone in a room, being tied in, being physically restrained. You very rarely see physical restraints now. Right. A big issue with chemical restraints in this country in our nursing homes, but not physical restraints. And so I think that things have changed. I think that the full promise of the reform law, though, has never been realized. And frankly, the reason for that is because it's never really been effectively enforced. And that's a large part of what we focus on, is how to get those rules better implemented in the lives of residents.
And we're going to talk about those rules and also how you guys can help with the implementation. But before we do that, I want to ask, in your opinion, what are the greatest ethical challenges facing the elder care industry today?
Well, I think that a lot of that comes down to staffing, actually. And staffing, we always come back to staffing in this sector. And staffing is, study after study has shown clinically how important staffing is. And now, I think the studies cumulative show that the more staff, the better, period. There's never an end point to which more staff doesn't help residents in institutional settings.
Right.
And I think I think morally, it really comes down to to the extent to which the operator is willing to invest in their staff and therefore in their residents. So it's kind of a big picture, but going down to the nexus of the resident and the caregiver, how we're maintaining that, or how someone is maintaining that connection, and the sense of understanding and acceptance, or realization of their role with a very, very vulnerable population.
Well, and also, I mean, when you were talking about the operator and how much money they're willing to invest, I mean, is it concern you that so much venture capital money is coming into nursing homes, and it almost feels like we're repeating the 70s and 80s again in terms of people, you may not have maybe Medicare and Medicaid, but you've got other people now that are riding in the car with you in the form of venture capitalists that want to make profit.
Terrifying. Yeah, I frankly think it's terrifying, and we see this, in many different sectors, and certainly in many different areas of healthcare. I read a lot of articles about that, but what we see especially in nursing homes, and we should be careful, I think, or I should be careful to distinguish between nursing homes and other, adult care settings, because other adult care settings there are no federal rules or standards around assisted living in particular, and those settings. Although they're caring for individuals with very, very similar needs to those of nursing home residents. But I think on the whole, for both of those, both those parts of the elder care sector, I think the infusion of investment by private equity and private investment is, as I said, is really terrifying, frankly, because there is not only, there's not only the disconnect with the community, there's actually quite often a disconnect with having a sustainable, viable organization or operation. So it's not even that you don't care and you're just putting out socks that are going to last 4 wears and then they're going to fall apart. It's that once you're going to what private equity does, the model is that they go in there, they pull out resources, and then they walk away with having capitalized as much as possible within, as I understand it, 2 to 5 years. So that's not and that's been a huge development, I would say, that I've noticed over the past 10 years, that there are operators out there who just are not even interested in operating a crummy facility, as you were alluding to, what we saw in the 60s, 70s, but that were just really stripping all the resources, or as many as possible, and then walking away.
There's 2 things I want to mention. There's a podcast on NPR, the show called 1A. And they did a profile on nursing homes. You should check it out. And then they talk a lot about venture capital money. When they come in, they sign these massive rental agreements with the facility, because VC is one entity with a different tax ID, and you've got, a nursing facility with a completely different tax ID. So they have these massive rental contracts as profit centers. And you're right, they do. I mean, they take all the resources away for the facilities to be able to effectively manage the care and provide an overall better quality to their residents. When I first started the show, the second thing I wanted to mention, when I first started the show, something struck me that I've still not forgotten, and you just brought it top of mind for me when you were describing nursing facilities and venture capital. I was talking to a guy who has like access for reviews on assisted living facilities, and he's kind of like a connector. He's like a middleman between people that need an assisted living bed or a bed in an assisted living facility and an assisted living facility that has open beds. And I asked him, I said, well, how do you measure the quality of care so that you're not putting somebody into a bad situation? And he goes, well, a lot of these assisted living facilities are owned by large conglomerates or large corporations. And if they don't do a good job, they just have a new management team come in. They just clean house and find new people. And I thought to myself, that's got to be so disruptive. When you have and I didn't realize it was that simple, because, for example, in my business, you can't just clean house and start over without, a huge culture change. It would be a completely different company. And so just this very kind of fragmented and compartmentalized, at arm's length type of approach to care I think it is troublesome. I agree with you. So
Thanks, that's very interesting.
Yeah, let's move on. So what are the most common complaints that you're hearing from residents or their families about the care that they're receiving?
Well, persistently, it's been inadequate staff and things that come from inadequate staff. So call bells not answered,
right.
People that are being left, not being helped to go to the bathroom, and then having to go in their bed
Sure.
or whatever, and sometimes sitting there for hours. And what we're hearing, I think it's been exacerbated. As we end the COVID pandemic emergency. I don't want to say we're ending the COVID pandemic, but we saw throughout, and there's been studies that have shown this as well, but we track the data very carefully. And the data showed that for the first year and a half, staffing actually stayed pretty consistent
right.
in nursing homes. But what happened was, as the emergency eased up, facilities started admitting residents without hiring more staff. And that's what we're seeing now. So sorry to get off track, but essentially we've seen an exacerbation of all those things, of people not getting help with feeding, people not getting help, as I said, going to the bathroom or ambulating, or not getting the services that they need, whether they be psychosocial services or clinical services. So those are really I would say the biggest issues we have. Food is always another really big issue. Some places spend as little as like $2 a day on residents' food.
Wow. And
you could imagine, especially now where food prices have gone up,
sure.
what the implications of that is for residents.
And I think people don't understand, and you mentioned it earlier when you were talking about the issues that we're having with chemical restraints. I think people don't realize that inadequate staffing leads to an increase in abusing those chemical restraints. Essentially sedating somebody to the point to where they can't do anything but just sit in a wheelchair and look out the window. Nobody is meant to have that type of life anywhere, period, And so because they can't reach staffing levels instead, and I mean, I don't, again, let's just say we're speculating on this conversation, but, when they don't have the staff to meet the needs, they use a form of psychoactive drugs, sedatives, to essentially relax the individual to the point to where they're easier to manage, and they honestly can't, so at times, even push a call bell because they're so sedated, and I think that's terrible. But I think it's important because some people come in and a lot of people that come and visit their loved ones in a facility, and they look and they talk to them and they say, you seem different. What happened? And it's because they've been, I'll put it like this. When I receive an individual from a facility to live in one of our community homes, the list of medications that I get is, it's like this. To live in a community, it's like that. It's like, why are you giving them all these medications? And they're like, well, and so whenever they transition out into the community, we're like, they don't need all of this. Like, these are all like doctor's orders that were written by your facility-based doctor. When he gets an appointment with a local PCP, they say, yeah, you need this, this, and this, and you're good. So think about that.
Well, it's not surprising, but it's so distressing.
Yeah.
It's a huge issue. There was just a study that came out from the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General in November that found that 80% of residents in nursing homes are on some psychotropic drug.
Yeah.
And it's so dangerous. I mean, the antipsychotics are so dangerous in particular.
Yeah. And how many are also on opioids?
I think that would be I'm guessing that would be included. I could be wrong, but
I think it would be.
Yeah.
So how does the Long-Term Care Community Coalition work to ensure that residents receive high-quality care and dignity in their daily lives?
So most of our focus is on policy.
Okay.
So we work a lot with and try to educate policymakers, and of course reach out to people in the press and the public as well. But it's really been more policy focused, trying to working to assess what's working and what's not working.
Okay.
We do a lot of research on that, looking at enforcement, and oversight, quality assurance, in effect, of nursing homes, and urging policymakers to address those issues. But over the past, I would say, 10 to 12 years, we've done much more in the area of educating and empowering families, residents, and others who are working with residents and families directly. The idea being that it's so hard to move policy, it's so hard to
Right.
change enforcement, that if we can help equip residents and those working with them, their family members in particular, with the information that they need and with the knowledge about their rights and resources to help them advocate for their residents, that is another way of hopefully improving care and improving dignity.
And, when it comes to policy, I feel like there's a massive disconnect, and that's probably an understatement, because even facilities that work primarily with Medicaid, like you said, 70% of nursing home revenue comes from Medicaid. Like, Medicaid is woefully underfunded, especially in states that haven't expanded Medicaid, like my state of Tennessee. And if you run the financials behind receiving Medicaid reimbursement, unless you're a nonprofit, you have to make like sacrifices, and a lot of times those sacrifices come at the direction of your residents. And it's kind of black and white when you present it to policymakers, and the fact that that some people that are in positions of power that can make a difference, when they presented with the statistics, they don't immediately act on it, is rather strange to me. So I think you focusing on families and your organization focusing on families, I think if you can create enough awareness within a community of Americans, a substantial amount of Americans, to that vote, obviously, to get the attention of lawmakers, you could actually get significant policy change in the right direction. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean more reimbursement by any means, but all of the biggest laws that have come over the course of our lifetime have all come because enough people, like the EPA, for example, have started because people said, "Nah, we're not doing this. We're making a significant change." And you go, and maybe it's harder now than it was back then, but I still feel like there's a chance if enough people start to understand that we're in a crisis, and we have to solve this problem.
Yeah, it is very challenging. I mean, especially if you talk about empowering families. Families, of course, come and go. It's rare that someone continues their advocacy once their loved one has passed, and the average nursing home resident lives in a facility for 2 years. So
Right.
there is that flux, and people come in, as I'm sure generally speaking, in an emergency situation or urgent situation, that they find they can't live safely at home any longer, or they're coming from a hospital, and the hospital says, "Look, you have we're checking you out. We're discharging you in 48 hours.
Right.
Here's a list of facilities," without really
Right.
helping them to be discerning about where they were going. So it is very challenging. I think it's also challenging because it's very nuanced. I mean, yes, Medicaid reimbursement is less than Medicare reimbursement, but there are a lot of nursing homes that are making, and owners are making, millions and millions of dollars off of Medicaid, millions of dollars every day.
Yeah.
And we see that, when we're able to get verified data, the data that I've seen, at least, always point to two things: either an utter lack of accountability, that too much of the information that nursing homes provide on their finances is fraudulent frankly.
Oh, wow.
And not all of it, but too much of it, and including so-called cost reports. We won't get into the details, but these are the kind of things that we try to dig into to properly inform policymakers on both the state and federal level. That if we are going to give more resources to nursing homes, we have to make sure that goes to the care staff and to the residents, and there has to be more accountability for where that money goes. Because as you noted before, one thing that facilities will do is they'll sell the underlying property either to a third party or to quite often an organization they themselves own.
Right.
And then they could jack up the the rents with virtual impunity. No one really looks at that, at least on an official basis, and then turn around and say, "Oh, we're losing money."
But are you do you feel more confident because there's 72 million baby boomers that are going to need long-term, or at least have a 70% chance of needing long-term care, and a good portion of that is going to happen in a skilled facility? Just the mere presence of volume, do you think that that's going to get so many more people engaged in this conversation so that policymakers may actually listen to the fact that this is a problem?
I think it could. I think it's a really interesting way of putting it. I mean, people talk about that, but frankly, Kosta, not in as interesting a way as you just said. People say, "Oh, the baby boomers are coming." The silver tsunami, which I think is an obnoxious term. But the fact is, I see it more. I think what you're saying resonates more with me is that we're seeing a larger number of people and a larger portion of our population that will be there, and to some extent that is going to have to modify both nursing homes and I would say assisted living, whether we in the industry I should say likes it or not. In order to be a part of it, we see more and more people, as we mentioned before, going into assisted living instead of a nursing home. Up till now, there's really no federal standards for assisted living care. But that's going to change.
Let's talk about that. So, and it ties right into the next question. How do the regulations and the laws surrounding elder care facilities differ from state to state, and how does this impact the quality of care that residents receive?
That's a really important question. So, I mean, for nursing homes, the standards are the federal standards apply to everyone, and the federal standards are really strong. Again, as I mentioned before, they're not very well enforced, but in and of themselves, they are really, really good standards. Some states can have stronger standards, and some do. Some have minimum staffing requirements for nursing homes, et cetera. But the federal rules, again, are pretty strong. For assisted living, there are no federal standards in regard to quality of care.
Interesting.
Or staffing, or even data. So we don't even have the data. Let me just quickly say, for nursing homes, we have a lot of data on what goes on.
Right.
There's something called the minimum data set, the MDS, which is assessments, dozens and dozens of different things. Is the person losing weight? Are they more depressed? Are they getting certain drugs, et cetera? We have none of that for assisted living, so we don't even know, as I just said, what is going on in terms of the care for those residents.
Is that because they don't receive federal funding, so they're not required to report in the way that nursing homes are?
That raises a really good point. And 48 states have some form of Medicaid assisted living.
They do.
So
you're right.
It's not. Yeah. So it's not a guaranteed. It's not a guaranteed benefit the way nursing home care is for people on Medicaid, but it is a growing number of people are accessing assisted living through Medicaid. And I think it's worth noting that, providers don't like that Medicaid rates are less than Medicare rates or private pay rates.
Right.
They're lower.
Right.
But if you move that rate, it's actually generally, as I understand it, generally speaking, the assisted living rate for Medicaid is half of the nursing home rate. And the reason why I mention all that is because in the assisted living world, half of the nursing home rate is a lot of money. It's actually a pretty decent return because you're providing a fraction of the staff. I mean, you're not providing, according to the law, you're not providing 24-hour skilled nursing care the way a nursing home is by definition. So it is a good amount of money, and the money does follow. Not everybody. Most assisted living is still private pay, but there is a connection there. I think that the industry, both the assisted living and the nursing home industries, and there's a lot of intertwining there, of course, are very well connected politically. The major trade associations have tens of millions of dollars each to lobby in Congress and on the state level. So they've really kept back, especially on the assisted living side, they've kept back having those federal rules. I should mention just very quickly, there is one federal set of rules for assisted living, and that is that came out, I guess, about 4 or 5 years ago, and that is the requirements for what's considered a home and community-based setting, and it's probably something that you understand pretty well based upon what I understand about your work. Is that what does it mean to be a home and community-based setting? What is required of that? And there were no rules for that for many years. But that's the one place where if you're a Medicaid assisted living, which is generally just slots, it's not the entire assisted living facility, but just slots or beds or rooms. That the federal government is looking and expecting certain community characteristics, like you'll have privacy and you'll have access to food 24/7, you'll have access to the outside world, to the community, that it's not an institutional setting the way a traditional nursing home is.
Right. So when families watch this video and they get educated on some ways to essentially hold assisted living facilities and nursing homes compliant, what steps can families take to ensure that their loved ones are receiving adequate care in these facilities?
Well, I would say, I think two things. One is that I always, if I may,
sure, of course.
I always advise families and residents to start with those who are closest to them. I hate to say start at the bottom, but start with those who are closest with them and work your way up. If the first thing you do is you make a complaint to the administrator or to your state health department, where do you go from there if you don't get the answer that you want?
Right.
Whereas, most people, we do have, abuse, of course, in facilities, but most people, I believe, who go into a nursing home to provide care, they want to do a good job. And so what I, advise people is to, ask, see the caregiver as your partner, or try to, even if it's a situation where you feel like, okay, this person's not caring for me, they're being neglectful. They want to do a good job. They certainly are not going to be happy if you say you're doing a crappy job. Right. Change. That's not a productive.
The first person that provides the direct support. So the nursing aide, essentially, I think is what they classify.
Yeah, that's what. And then if you don't get a good response, and then certainly work your way up. And this is not, if something is an emergency, someone's in danger. Of course, you you call 911 or you do what you need to do to ensure someone's safety. But I think for quality of life issues, and things like that, that it's really best to try to bring that those people in, and then, or non-emergency situations, is to do that. And I would say the other point that I wanted to make is that we've been talking a lot, and I think a lot about how different the rules are for nursing homes and for assisted living, and how can we advocate for people no matter where they are. And what I'm kind of thinking is that no matter where someone is, they are entitled to get good quality care and to be treated with dignity. And so even if you're in a situation like an assisted living that is not under the nursing home requirements, I would, again, you can't use the nursing home requirements to advocate for that individual, but I think you could say, look, this is a good dementia care practice. This is, we know that these drugs, the antipsychotics in particular that we were talking about before, are potentially very dangerous for seniors. So I would say, understanding that what just basic standards of care are, as much as you can, and utilizing that to leverage one's individual advocacy could be helpful. It's something I've been thinking about a lot lately.
So you're from New York, I believe, or just from the Northeast, or?
I'm in New Jersey right now. I'm actually looking at New York City.
And the reason, here's why I bring that up. So New York obviously is extremely progressive, relative to other places in the United States. Let's just put it like that. But one of the things that I've followed for quite some time now is in New York, they have a rule for caregivers where if they work 24 hours, they only get paid for, I think it's 18 hours, or if it might even be or 16 hours. It's something like that. Anyway, if they work 24 hours straight, they won't get paid for all 24 hours. And they had a big fight, is the best word I can think of, in the state legislature in New York City or in New York State to change that law so that 24 hours is paid as 24 hours. And so the reason that I say this is because if a state like New York, who has one of the most progressive agendas and workers' rights first agendas, in my opinion, can't identify the necessity or the value of paying caregivers for every hour that they work, just essentially giving them a thank you for, wow, you survived this pandemic and you guys were on the front lines of this. What hope do we have for other states to value caregivers?
Well, I think and I want to be careful because I think you're referring to home care givers, which I'm not as expert on that.
That's good.
But I think that I think a lot of this really has to come from the federal rules. I think that is a much stronger basis, generally speaking, and hopefully in conjunction with the states. And you're right, states do vary. I would say, at least we do most of our research and analyses are nationwide. And
okay.
So a lot of our work, we've looked many times over the years at nursing home oversight. And persistently in the studies that we do, looking at years and years of federal data, New York and New Jersey are the weakest states in the entire country when it comes to holding nursing homes accountable for quality care.
But why?
And so I think in some ways you do have a more progressive state here in New York, but at the same time there's so much money because it's a wealthier state, it's a more populous state. Mm-hmm. There's so much money in being a provider here that there is a lot of industry influence.
Interesting.
And don't forget, it's also Wall Street. You're the center of just industry, generally speaking,
right,
in the United States, if not the one of the centers in the world, and that that really holds sway. So I think that there's a lot of different things that are going on, and it makes it hard. I guess if I could just say one quick thing, sometimes people don't get care within their state, especially if you're on living close to a border. Sure. Your nearest nursing home, your nearest home care or assisted living or home care provider could easily be in another state or could be multi-state.
Absolutely.
And so it's really important to, again, just like I was saying with resident-centered advocacy, to you should be entitled to good care, and no matter where you are. And as a worker, you should be entitled to a living wage and a decent working condition. I mean, being a caregiver is one of the most dangerous positions in the country, according to the Census Bureau. I
mean, you're like a power lifter every single day. I mean, imagine. And the statistics for how people take care of themselves in this country is not great, and especially on the lower wage spectrum. And so, nobody's waking up, drinking a protein shake, cracking a couple of raw eggs and going into a nursing home to get ready for work, but that's honestly the type of work that they're doing, is wearing, you need a belt, you need those gait belts, but you might as well just put on a powerlifting belt, cause you're doing some heavy, serious work. And it's going to touch on my next point, because I want to talk about staff training and development, how important that is to promoting high quality care for residents. But then I also want to talk about technology. So, I am the quintessential millennial. I believe that technology is going to solve all of our problems and save the day as we can roll it out. But do you think that technology is going to play a significant role in the future of elder care?
I do, and I think in many different ways. I think certainly having better information, even on a facility level, just for the provider, on what's going on with your residents, and hopefully being better able to handle those tasks. We were talking about the use of drugs before to sedate residents, but it's not really cost effective if you really know what you're doing. And this gets to both training, equipping staff, but also having those other resources. And I think that if you are able to leverage both better staff training as well as technology to really understand what is going on with your residents and what their needs are, that you can better, I hate to say juggle, but better manage, in an effective and humane way what those services should be. And then on top of it, there's a lot of innovations, electronic pets, robo pets, and different robotic things. And I think that could be really interesting and really useful. I don't want to, oversell it, but I think that, thinking about COVID and thinking about, the pandemic, people being isolated, how isolated killed people, literally killed, and just was so horrible for so many people. But if you had one of those robots with the screen that you could see your family member, and just very quickly to add to that, you were talking about the baby boomers getting older, and a more technologically advanced generation, is that people will be much more comfortable with iPads and with those kind of things than people who are now in their 80s and 90s and older might be.
There is so we're currently working or starting to begin a pilot with United Healthcare, and it's a technology first remote supports pilot, removing some of the human element just for a few hours a day to see how the residents essentially fare without having a human person there, but having sensors and passive monitoring, a lot of data driven technology that collects a lot of information and allows the person that's monitoring the home to be able to react if necessary. Health tech, wearable stuff like that. A nursing home, because it's a facility, is so condensed. We have little houses spread out all across, a 80-mile radius. A nursing home is condensed into one facility. If you didn't necessarily approach the technology aspect from a electronic, futuristic role, but you made investments in ceiling track lifts, mechanical bath lifts. They already use electric Hoyer lifts, but I mean something that can, allow for the staff to be able to safely transfer individuals without having to, jack up a Hoyer lift or what have you, or even do it remotely from a command center. You could really help a lot of those issues with call buttons not getting answered. But I mean, it's just you really got to think deep about what exactly caregivers do not want to do or have trouble doing or don't have the resources to do, and target that. And if you can do it, whether it's a nursing home, assisted living, home care, in your own home, whatever it is, if you solve those small problems, you're going to reduce. It's almost like when the pressure's at all the way on red, and if you just turn the knob just a little bit, it'll go down and it'll go away from that critical point. All literally, just a small turn. That's where we're at, just a little bitty turn. So before we wrap up, I got to ask you, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of long-term care?
Well, you may be a little bit more optimistic considering when you inspired me to consider about the changes that will come as the baby boomers, get a large group of baby boomers get up.
Second largest population subset, by the way.
Wow.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. It's a second largest. So millennials the largest, but baby boomers 72 million, and they're literally just 10 million less than the millennial generation. So. Anyway, Sorry, I digress. I interrupted.
So that made me a little bit more optimistic, but I think generally speaking, pretty pessimistic as of now because of the corporatization of these industries and just the runaway use of private equity and other kinds of very sophisticated private investments. I mean, that's what I've seen over the past, I would say, especially 10 years. Is just this growing sophistication and a willingness, as we mentioned at the start, to really suck out resources and then walk away.
Yeah.
Not even a commitment to, not so much to resident well-being, but a commitment to the business itself. And then that leaves deserts of people not having access to care, et cetera. So I guess a little bit of both. But thank you for for bringing in the optimism, because otherwise I would have just said pessimistic.
Well, I'll tell you, I've been doing this for 12 years and actually 13 years now. Wow. Sorry, I keep forgetting it's 23. So I've been doing it for 13 years, and I've owned this company with my wife for 10 years, and so much consolidation has happened just in the state of Tennessee. I was telling the person I was interviewing yesterday, so we started with like 450 providers in Tennessee, and we're down to like 250 because all of them have been, consolidated. And when I say like 450 in the IDD world and in the elderly physically disabled world, and they've been bought up by large conglomerates, usually out-of-state conglomerates like Texas, North Carolina, Louisiana, and it is how healthcare, and it could be long-term care hospitals, nursing homes. But, it's happening and she said something that was rather profound. She said, we learned that there is no competition and massive consolidation in baby formula whenever we had the baby formula shortage. So, and I think we learned in the early 1920s that, big monopolies are not a good thing. They're, at least for consumers, they're not. So,
Right.
So we always like to end the show with a call to action. What advice do you have for listeners who are considering long-term care options for themselves or their aging parents?
Well, I would say, to the extent possible, shop around. I always hesitate, when we talk to policymakers in particular, one of the first things I say is that family members or potential residents shouldn't have to be experts in order to access good care and a humane condition.
Right.
But unfortunately, there's there's some good providers out there, and there are too many not good providers out there. And it's really important to do as much due diligence as possible. And, speaking to people who are independent, if I could put in a plug for our website, we have a lot of information, nursingHome411.org. We have a lot of the data I spoke about earlier. We have staffing levels for all the nursing homes in the country and state files. We have their penalty records, et cetera, that you could see. Care Compare on the Medicare website is really good for nursing homes. And then we also, I know on our website, on our assisted living page, as I said, there are not a lot of consistent rules, as you and I were talking about, but we do have some guides for choosing an assisted living, and everything on our website is free. People can use it any way they wish, but it's a stressful situation, and so I would say give it as much thought as possible. It's hard. I mean, I'm dealing with that myself with family members. It's hard to to help them to understand that maybe it'd be a better situation for them in a residential care, and so helping with that transition would be and thinking about it, would be as good as it would be useful. Excuse me.